everybody, we're back with another fiction nuts and bolts video, and in this video we're talking about how to write transitions in your novel. What's up, guys? My name is Michael Laron with authorlevelup.com, helping you write world-class stories better and faster, and I make these videos because I believe that each of you has Michael Crichton, Patricia Briggs, and Neil Gaiman level talent, and you just need help unlocking it. So if you're new here, consider subscribing and click that little bell, ding, 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 to get notifications every time I have a new writing video. And this video is really interesting because I learned a lot in making this video. And the video recommendation came to us from subscriber O Politico, and she asked in the comments of my last video, what is the most effective way to write scene transitions, i.e. transitioning from day to night or night to day or Monday to Tuesday? What's the best way to do that? Because she was struggling with making those transitions happen. And so I dug into this a little bit, and I had a little bit of fun. And we have two issues that we want to handle this week. Okay, the first issue is what types of transitions exist. We got to just understand what the stadium we're in is, right? We got to get the ticket to the right stadium so we can watch the right ball game. Terrible analogy, but you get where I'm going with this. And issue number two is how can we write transitions to be as seamless as possible. Now, I recognize that many of you are in a hurry. You got a lot of things going on, and so we're going to be nuts and boltsy. We're going to be practical in this video. But you can use the timestamps in the video description to jump ahead to the major revelations if you dare. But just know you'll miss a few golden nuggets. All right, so issues. What types of transitions exist, and how can we write transitions to be as seamless as possible? Okay, so first off, as I looked at many of the bestsellers that I had on my shelf, I realized that there are really, from what I could tell, only four major types of transitions at the macro level. We got to understand this first, all right? We've got transitions from book to book, so a transition from book 1 to book 2. We have transitions from chapter to chapter, so from chapter 1 to chapter 2. We've got transitions from section to section, so within a chapter, separated by section break. And then we've got transitions that might happen within a chapter, okay? So just going to lay this groundwork because we got to keep this practical. All right, so this video is really only going to cover chapter to chapter and section to section transitions. So there are some different things to keep in mind when we're doing this. And let's just jump into it, okay? So the three books that I picked for this, you know, normally I would just grab random books off my shelf for this because it's kind of fun. But this time I needed to be a bit more intentional to answer the question. And so I looked for books where the passage of time was prominent in the story and it jumped out at me. And the first thing I thought about this, well, thrillers are great examples of this because they have internal clocks, right? The clock is an important part of the story. So how does a thriller mega bestseller author handle these transitions from day to night or any other type of transition there might be? All right, so I picked The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton. And then I also wanted to get some science fiction and fantasy in here. I got two fantasy novels. One is Moon Called by Patricia Briggs. That's one where I remember this story took place over several days. And then I wanted to get something that was a little bit longer in terms of scope. And I picked American Gods by Neil Gaiman because that takes place, if anyone has read it, it takes place over several months. All right. So we got a spectrum here. Patricia Briggs is a few days with some casual transitions, and we'll explain what casual means here later in the video. And then Michael Crichton, the book takes place over a few days, but there are some very strict transitions. Crichton follows some very strict rules for himself in the book. And then American Gods takes place over several months. So I thought by picking novels that take place over a spectrum, that might give us some interesting insights into the commonalities on how the mega bestsellers handle these transitions. All right, so let's look at Moon Called. This is a great novel, a great series, the Mercedes Thompson series by Patricia Briggs. It's about a coyote shapeshifter, or a coyote shifter, I should say. And the first finding that I found in looking at this and just kind of paging through the novel is that the narrator, Mercy, explicitly states when the time changes, almost always at the beginning of the chapter. So, for example, if she's sleeping over at a friend's house. I'm just being silly, right? But if the main character is sleeping over at a friend's house and the chapter ends with her falling asleep, the next chapter will open with the next morning I went home. So therefore, the narrator explicitly states the time. We know at the very beginning of the chapter what time it is, and that serves as our transition. Okay, that's finding number one with Moon Called. Now, the second finding is that in this novel, the chapter breaks serve as the transition. So, chapter X, last line, would be I went to sleep. And then this is actually an example in the book, but it's paraphrased. And then chapter Y, the first line is I was starving as I walked down the street to get a breakfast burrito. All right. So we know that the chapter break serves as that transition from day to night. The author doesn't really do anything other than that. So the chapter break is the transition. I thought that was pretty insightful. And then the third thing we need to understand about Moon Called is that the narrator grounds you in the exact time when it suits the story. When it doesn't, they make the time pass quickly. And let me illustrate this with an example. Now, again, this is all made up. This is kind of similar to something that was in the novel. So at the beginning of one of the chapters, the narrator says, it was 7:30 when I arrived at the complex. The moon was already high in the navy sky, wreathed in smoky clouds. And then I've just got this little block here. We've got some narrative dialogue and action that represents about 2,000, maybe 3,000 words, right? We're just hearing the story. Story's unfolding about what she's doing at this complex. And then in the middle of the chapter, just out of nowhere, we hear 2 hours later, I sat at the edge of a loading bay. Dimitri hadn't arrived yet. Now the moon had turned pale. So it being 7:30 was pretty important. It was important that we know that because that's how the author kept track of time, right? But then it's not really that important about the 2 hours later. So the 2 hours later was just really used as a narrative device to help us get to the next level of the story because that was the most convenient thing for the author to do at the time. So I thought that that was also very interesting. All right, so this happened very casually with no section or chapter break. Okay, I'm going to hit this a little bit in a second, but this was very casual. So this is an example of a casual transition. The story follows the character very closely. It's told in the first person. It's told over her shoulder, or at least to you. And I think this is how a lot of you are probably writing your novels. The time is important, but it's not a central mechanism to the story, and so you just want to make sure that you're keeping track of those transitions so that the reader doesn't go, huh? Right? So this is what I would call a casual sense of time in the story. Right? Now, let's look at Crichton, because Crichton is almost the exact opposite. For the first 60% of the Andromeda strain, Crichton lets you know exactly what time it is, usually at the beginning of the chapter or the section. And what's interesting about this book, what I remembered about it, was that the book is structured by days. So there are high-level sections where it's like day 1, and then chapter, day 2, chapter, right? And it's structured by days. And so I thought, how does Crichton handle these transitions between the days? And the first thing I notice is that he does almost exactly the same thing that Briggs does. And that is he always lets you know what time it is, usually at the beginning of the chapter when it's important. Okay. Now, the second thing I found out about Crichton is that this is something he did that jumped out at me more than it did with Briggs. And that is that the description of the setting routinely followed the announcement of the time. All right. So, for example, if Crichton said that it was 8:30 p.m., while the scientists are trying to figure out the cause of this virus that's ravaged or that has potential to ravage the world, then Crichton would follow that immediately with, the moon was pale in the sky. I'm being silly. But you got the time, and then you got a description that grounded the reader in the scene immediately after. So it's not enough just to state the time. You've also got to state or explain what the reader should see. So you want to ground the reader with those 5 senses, which you guys know I hit that all the time. Now, the third thing with Michael Crichton was that he did the same thing that Briggs did, was that the chapter or section break served as the transition. Okay, so if we transition from day 1 to day 2, we followed the clock pretty closely. So every chapter, we always knew what time it was. But when things shifted. So if the chapter ended at 11:59 and the next chapter picked up at 12:01, we would get a section break or a chapter break. So that's pretty important. So Crichton definitely follows some strict rules for himself with the clock, a lot more strict than Moon called. With Crichton, it was almost like every chapter on the first sentence you knew what time it was. Whereas with Briggs, it was more casual. Sometimes we got the clock every couple of chapters, or maybe she weaved it in here and there, but it wasn't as strict or regimented as Crichton, and that's just an interesting call out. Now, with American Gods, Neil Gaiman, one of my all-time favorite novels, just a classic. I found two things with Gaiman that is important to point out, and that is that Gaiman used the chapter and section breaks to mark the passage of time as well. So, American Gods takes place over several months. So there was one chapter where it ends in December, and then the next chapter picks up in January. So I thought it was interesting that even though the novel was a bigger scope in terms of time, Gaiman used the same techniques, which was a classic chapter break or section break to mark that passage of time. No matter how much time passes, isn't it interesting that Gaiman used the exact same technique as Crichton and Briggs? Pretty insightful. Now, the second thing about Gaiman is that his chapter breaks were very similar to Briggs and Crichton's. He always let you know when it was. So you didn't often get it was 7:30. You almost got it was Christmas Day, and then it was the day after Christmas. So, that sort of thing. He always kept you grounded. He always let you know where you were right around the beginning of the chapter when it was important and convenient to do so. All right, so let's just jump to it, because you guys know, I got to say it, I'm not an academic. I'm not going to sit here and talk about theory. I'm not going to sit here and talk about things that's like, oh, that's really nice, it makes me feel really good, and then you go sit down at your computer and nothing happens. No, I'm a pracademic. We got to keep this practical, okay? So to answer the question, issue number 1, what types of transitions exist? Well, the ones we talked about are chapter to chapter and section to section. So when we're thinking about day to night, and night to day, and Monday to Tuesday, and January to February, and 2012, 2013. We're thinking about chapters, and we're thinking about sections, and we're thinking about chapter breaks and section breaks. And for our purposes today, the techniques work the same on both, as we called out from all three authors. So that's the answer to issue number 1. Issue number 2. So let's get into some nuts and bolts here. This is where I think this will be the most helpful to everyone watching. The issue is, how can we write transitions to be as seamless as possible based on everything that we learned so far? And I learned quite a bit here, okay? I'm not going to lie. This was really eye-opening for me. Number 1 is that the main goal is to keep the reader oriented so that they never question what time it is. Now, I know some people are probably rolling their eyes and they're like, Michael, you're such a simpleton. Duh. I mean, come on, right? But it's so fundamental and it's so simple, and that's the key. Keep the reader oriented so that they never question what time it is. Just like when you are going through your day, you always know what time it is, but unless you've got something really important going on, you're just kind of casually aware of the clock. Very few of us sit in a room without a window all day. We always know what time it is when we're going through our own lives, right? So shouldn't the reader know what time it is at all times when they're going through a novel? You know what I'm saying. All right, so the key here is to keep the reader aware of time early and often. Okay, now the second thing is to announce the time whenever it changes. It's kind of like a grandfather clock in your house, when it dings, ding, 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 and it dings at the hour, it dings however many times the hour is, and at the half hour it dings one time. Always announce the time whenever it changes in your novel. So if you have a thriller that has a true clock, or any kind of novel where the clock is central to the story, where the reader has to know what time it is, because maybe the world is going to end at midnight, so we got to know if it's 11:59, right? So if you have a true clock, ring that clock and let the reader know what time it is exactly, like Crichton does. So 11:59 a.m., 12:01 p.m., or military time, 2200 hours, whatever that clock is, ring that clock early and often. And if you don't have a true clock in your story, more like a science fiction and fantasy novel where the reader just needs to know what time it is because it's helpful for them to understand and see the scene, simply tell the reader what time it is and or what time of day it is. if that is the type of story that you're telling. Okay. Now, third thing I found, announce the time as early as possible in the chapter to help keep the reader oriented. There's nothing wrong with, getting to the end of a chapter and announcing the time. But what I found from the mega bestsellers is that more often than not, they always announce the time early in the chapter, usually somewhere in the first line, somewhere in the first paragraph, or somewhere on the first page. Preferably, the first line might get a little too on the nose, but hey, it's just a tool. It's a technique. Readers aren't going to know it's there, right? They just need to know what time it is. All right, so early and often. Now, another thing here, and you probably saw this coming, and this is a direct answer to O Politico's question, and that is, how do I manage these transitions? Well, a chapter break equals a change in time, if you want it to, right? Now, sometimes we don't use chapter breaks for that. Sometimes we use chapter breaks for tension. Sometimes we use chapter breaks for other things. But if you want to transition a scene, just use a chapter break or use a section break. That's the one thing that readers are going to be familiar with, and you can never go wrong when you sing that song. So if you're transitioning from day to night, Monday to Tuesday, December to January, doesn't matter. Use a chapter break. All right. Now, number 5, I told you I got a lot of golden nuggets here. I love digging into this stuff. This is my passion. All right. Number 5, and this is one that might be a little difficult to understand, but I want to make sure we hit this. Okay. If you use a chapter break to break time, like transition from night to day, then that break signals importance. Okay. So if you transition time within a chapter without any section breaks, that might indicate that the change is less important. So remember the moon called example that I gave, where the character arrives at the complex at 7:30. Well, that's important because we listed that time and it's at the beginning of the chapter. But the 2 hours later thing, not as important, right? Not as important, okay? And so the next one that kind of ties into this is use the narrative itself to progress the clock when the change is less important. So to give you the example, the hero sneaks into the warehouse, notices it's 7 o'clock. Later in the chapter, she realizes it's 7:30. So what my message is, when you do that chapter break, that indicates importance. When you weave it in casually throughout the narrative without breaking the chapter, that means it's less important. Now, there are exceptions to that, right? So if you've got a high tense scene, like a fight scene or a final battle or some sort of scene where you've got a long drawn out sequence and the characters are constantly wanting to know what time it is, that might be a little bit different. But generally speaking, based on what I saw these mega bestsellers do, a chapter break, that's going to be more important in terms of the passage of time. Now, next thing, this is critical. This is something I've learned to take away, and I'm going to start making sure that I'm more intentional about this in my own works. All right, and that is that all 3 of these mega bestsellers, all 3 of them, all right, from different walks of life, okay, they all knew how to do this, and that is they fast followed their announcement of time with the description of setting to help the reader stay grounded. So it was 7:30, the moon was pale, right? It was 12 o'clock, the sun was shining bright. It was 7 o'clock p.m. and the frost was cracking on my windows, that sort of thing. It's very interesting that they all chose to do that. So if this is about grounding the reader, remember, we talk all the time about 5 senses and getting inside the character's head and grounding the reader in the senses of the character. This is how you do it. So I would almost make it like this reflex that whenever I'm writing a work in progress, if I announce the time, automatically describe the setting. Right? And it doesn't have to be much. It's just a line or 2. Okay. I did put a note on here that it's less necessary for changing time within the narrative itself versus using chapter breaks. That's more of an academic thing. Just take that for what it's worth. All right. So here are the big conclusions. First things first, keep time for the reader early and often, and keep it clean with chapter breaks. Like I said, use a chapter break to use your transitions. You can never go wrong when you sing that song. Second thing is, all 3 of these mega bestsellers typically use 1 to 2 sentences of description to describe the setting after announcing the time. I'm not saying you got to write pages. Neil Gaiman didn't do that. I mean, Neil Gaiman is probably the most eloquent and articulate of all probably the top 1% of writers. I mean, that guy knows how to write, man. And he did that. He just gave you a couple sentences of description to describe the setting after he announced the time. All right. Now, there's no right or wrong way to transition your chapters, because I know some people are going to ask, well, but how do I actually do it? How do I actually put that black and white on the page so that readers will be convinced by it? And the answer is, I don't think that there's any right or wrong way. You guys hear me say that in all of these nuts and bolts videos. There's no right or wrong way. There's just your way. I'm not going to sit here and be prescriptive and say that you got to have this many words after this, or then you got to have a character arc and all this. No right or wrong way. Just your way. How you do it and what you write and the imagery that you use and all that stuff, completely up to you to choose your own adventure. But the simpler, the better, because remember, if you do this, readers are not going to notice it, and that's what we want to do. We want to make these transitions as seamless as possible. All right, so another thing I want to talk about is about keeping time, okay? I think this is important because this is where we have to get a little bit more practical, right? Because, okay, yeah, Michael, you just said, let's make sure we do this and make sure we do this and keep time and early and often and blah, 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 blah. Okay, but how do we actually do that on the page? When we get to the computer after you watch this video, what can you do to make sure that you are following this advice? Okay, first thing that came to my mind, and this is something that I do already, but I had never thought about it with this particular thing, and that is consider using anchor words so you can check your work later. So what is an anchor word, Michael? I've never heard anybody else on YouTube or a blog or anybody talk about this. This is just something I came up with, okay? An anchor word is a word that helps you identify as the author something in your manuscript, okay? So let me give you two examples here. If it's nighttime and the narrator describes the sky, for your purposes as the author, to make sure that you don't lose track of the details that you're using, just simply use the word sky every time the narrator describes the setting. Okay, so that way you can do a find all for every instance of the word sky, and maybe you described the sky as cloudless in chapter 1, but then you described it as full of clouds in chapter 2. How many times have we all done that? That's just par for the course. But if we can avoid that, that's great. Another example, if it's morning, make sure that every time you mention the time, you use the word morning until morning becomes afternoon. So if you use the same anchor words every time you describe your setting, that's going to help you keep track of things, and it's going to help you keep track of time a little bit better. And then if you want to know what time it is at every point in the manuscript, or at least for a sequence of scenes, just search for your anchor word and it'll pull it up every time. So that way you can make sure you're staying consistent with your descriptions. All right. Another thing is if you fast follow your time with your description, which I recommend that you do based on what I saw today, you can also keep track of your descriptions with Find All. So what you might try is consider highlighting sections in your text that describe the time, or set them off with something like a hashtag, so that you can do a simple find and replace and remove the hashtag later. That way, when you're in editing, what you can do is just search for the hashtag and then look at every single instance of your description and make sure it matches your time and make sure you're consistent. Okay. Now, the last thing that you might want to consider with keeping time is after you finish your draft, consider building out a simple timeline of your story. Just write it down on a piece of paper, or keep it in Scrivener, or open up a separate Word doc and just list the different times. Because now you should have marked all that stuff with anchor words. So you should be able to find it, and you should be able to look for gaps and inconsistencies. Okay. So I hope that's practical. Let me know what you think. Was this helpful? Was it not helpful? And I want to let you guys know that if you like this video, you'll love my Writing Craft Playbook, Volume 1. It's 20 fiction and nonfiction tricks to help keep your readers in the zone. And it's written by Coach Michael Laurent. So it's a lot of visual examples, a lot of exactly what we talked about in this video, nuts and bolts, pracademic stuff that you can use in your next writing session. So, O Politico, I hope that I took a dive at this. I hope that it helps you in some way. I hope it answers your question. And I want to let everybody else know that if you have a craft question, holler at me. I love doing these videos. It's a lot of fun for me, and I learn a lot. Hope you guys are learning a lot as well. And you can let me know what your craft question is at authorlevelup.com/contact. And don't forget to subscribe. I'll talk to you next week, and peace.